Gaza, a name synonymous with suffering, a place where the echoes of past conflicts reverberate through the present, casting a long shadow over its people. A land scarred by conflict. Once again, it burns. The flames of war consume not just buildings but dreams and aspirations, leaving behind a trail of despair. The world watches, seemingly numb to the unfolding tragedy. News channels broadcast the devastation, but for many it is just another headline, another distant crisis. This is not new. It is a cycle of violence and oppression, deeply rooted in history. A history that has seen countless lives lost and futures shattered. A history where Palestinians have faced dispossession, occupation, and relentless assault. Their land taken, their homes destroyed, their rights denied. From the ashes of the Nakba, the Palestinian exodus of 1948, rose Gaza, a place that became a symbol of their enduring struggle and resilience. A sliver of land, densely populated, became a refuge for those who lost everything. But this refuge was fraught with challenges, as the people of Gaza tried to rebuild their lives amidst constant adversity. But refuge soon transformed into an open-air prison. The blockade tightened, restricting movement, goods, and hope. Surrounded by fences, controlled by checkpoints, Gaza's fate was sealed. The people found themselves trapped, their lives dictated by external forces. It became a place where hope struggled to survive. Yet, amidst the rubble and ruin, the spirit of the people remained unbroken. The world remained largely indifferent. International leaders offered words but little action, and the plight of Gaza continued, largely ignored by the global community. Decades passed, marked by intermittent wars and a brutal siege. Each conflict left deeper scars, each siege tightened the noose around Gaza's neck. Palestinian resilience, however, remained unbroken. They rebuilt, they resisted, they held on to hope even when the world seemed to have forgotten them. They dared to dream of freedom, of a future where their children could live without fear, a future where they could thrive, not just survive, a future brutally snatched away time and again. Yet the people of Gaza continue to dream, to hope, and to fight for a better tomorrow. January 2025, a glimmer of hope. The dawn of a new year brought with it a fragile sense of optimism. People dared to dream of a future where peace might finally take root. A ceasefire brokered by the Biden administration promised a reprieve from the violence. It was short-lived. The ink had barely dried on the agreement before tensions began to resurface. The promise of peace, like so many before, lay shattered. The hopes of millions were dashed as the fragile truce crumbled under the weight of long-standing animosities. The Trump administration's return to power brought with it a familiar callousness. Policies that prioritized political gain over human suffering re-emerged, exacerbating the already volatile situation. Domestic politics trumped human lives. The voices of those calling for peace were drowned out by the clamor of political maneuvering and partisan bickering. The ceasefire, fragile as it was, crumbled. The brief respite from violence gave way to renewed hostilities, as both sides prepared for the inevitable escalation. March 18, 2025. A date etched in blood. The day marked the beginning of a new wave of violence that would engulf the region. Israeli airstrikes rained down upon Gaza. The skies were filled with the roar of jets and the thunder of explosions as the city was pounded relentlessly. Homes, hospitals, schools, nothing was spared. The death toll soared. The destruction was indiscriminate, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Hundreds of Palestinian civilians, many of them children, perished. The human cost of the conflict was staggering, with countless lives lost and families torn apart. The world once again expressed its concern. Statements of condemnation and calls for restraint echoed through the halls of international institutions. Empty words that did little to comfort the grieving families. The international community's response, though vocal, was ultimately ineffectual. The ceasefire, it turned out, was a cruel illusion. A fleeting promise that dissolved into chaos, leaving behind a legacy of broken dreams and shattered lives. It had provided only a temporary respite, a brief pause before the next onslaught. The cycle of violence seemed unending, with each lull merely a precursor to further bloodshed. The underlying issues, the root causes of the conflict, remained unaddressed. The occupation continued. The deep-seated grievances and historical injustices that fueled the conflict were left to fester. The siege tightened its grip. The blockade, a constant source of suffering for the people of Gaza, became even more oppressive. And Gaza once more became the stage for a one-sided massacre. The cycle of violence and retribution continued, with no end in sight. The world watched, as it had so many times before, seemingly powerless to intervene. As bombs rained down, Gaza's already dire humanitarian situation spiraled into utter catastrophe. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Buildings crumbled, turning homes into tombs. The relentless bombardment left no corner untouched, no family unscathed. Hospitals, overwhelmed with casualties, struggled to cope. Medical supplies dwindled. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. The influx of injured was relentless, each new wave more severe than the last. The injured, many with horrific wounds, lay in crowded corridors, their moans echoing the city's agony. Makeshift beds lined the hallways and the smell of antiseptic mixed with the stench of blood. The scenes were harrowing, a testament to the human cost of the conflict. The siege, already choking Gaza for years, tightened its noose. The blockade restricted the flow of essential goods, exacerbating the suffering. The people of Gaza were trapped, their lives dictated by the whims of a blockade that showed no signs of easing. Essential supplies, food, water, medicine, all became scarce. Shelves in stores were empty and families rationed what little they had. The struggle for survival became more desperate with each passing day, as the basic necessities of life slipped further out of reach. The collective punishment of an entire population continued unabated. The blockade was not just a physical barrier but a psychological one, breaking the spirit of a people who had already endured so much. The humanitarian crisis deepened, with no end in sight. The world, with its pledges of aid and concern, seemed a distant, uncaring observer. International promises of help often fell short, and the global response was mired in politics and bureaucracy. For the people of Gaza, hope was a fragile, fleeting thing. Amidst the rubble, stories of resilience and despair unfolded. Families clung to each other, finding strength in unity. Acts of kindness and bravery shone through the darkness, as people helped their neighbors and shared what little they had. Doctors and nurses, working tirelessly, their own lives at risk. They were the unsung heroes, battling against impossible odds to save lives. Their dedication and courage were a beacon of hope in a landscape of despair. Families huddled in shelters, seeking refuge from the relentless bombardment. The shelters were overcrowded and the conditions were dire. Yet in these cramped spaces, a sense of community and solidarity emerged, as people supported one another through the darkest times. Children, their innocence stolen, their eyes reflecting the horrors they witnessed. They played amidst the ruins, their laughter a poignant reminder of what had been lost. The war had left an indelible mark on their young lives, shaping a generation that knew only conflict and suffering. The world watched. Governments issued condemnations. International organizations expressed their deep concern. But these words rang hollow. They lacked the weight of action. The silence, deafening and complicit, spoke volumes. The United Nations, paralyzed by geopolitical maneuvering, proved ineffective. The Security Council, often rendered toothless by veto power, failed to provide protection. The international community, seemingly immune to the suffering, remained on the sidelines. Why this apathy? Why this inaction? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, lies in the politics of power and the selective application of international law. Palestinian lives, it seemed, mattered less. Section 5. The Enabler. The United States, self-proclaimed champion of democracy and human rights, bears a heavy responsibility. Its unwavering support for Israel, its political cover for Israeli crimes, has enabled and emboldened successive Israeli governments. Military aid, diplomatic cover, a blind eye to violations, the U.S. has consistently shielded Israel from accountability. This unconditional support has fueled the cycle of violence and undermined any prospect of a just and lasting peace. The Trump administration's return to power signaled a complete disregard for Palestinian rights. Their embrace of Israeli aggression, their open hostility towards the Palestinian cause, emboldened the hardliners and further diminished hopes for a negotiated settlement. Section 6. Echoes of Injustice. The situation in Gaza is not merely a humanitarian crisis. It is a political crisis, a crisis of justice and accountability. Israel's actions, its policies of occupation, siege, and collective punishment, constitute grave violations of international law. The indiscriminate targeting of civilians, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, the denial of basic human rights, these are not isolated incidents. They are part of a systematic and deliberate policy aimed at subjugating the Palestinian population. The world's silence in the face of these crimes is deafening. It is a betrayal of the values enshrined in international law. It is a stain on the conscience of humanity. Section 7. A generation scarred. What are the long-term consequences of this endless cycle of violence and oppression? What does it do to the hearts and minds of the children growing up under the shadow of bombs and occupation? An entire generation of Palestinian children is being traumatized. They are growing up in a world where violence is the norm, where fear is a constant companion. Their education is disrupted, their childhood stolen. The psychological scars of this trauma will run deep. They will carry the burden of this conflict for years to come. Their future, like the future of Palestine, remains shrouded in uncertainty. Section 8. When silence becomes complicity, the world cannot afford to remain silent. Silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. When we witness injustice and choose to look away, we become complicit in its perpetuation. We have a moral obligation to act. We cannot stand idly by as innocent lives are lost, as a people's right to self-determination is trampled upon. We must demand accountability. We must demand justice. The time for empty words and hollow gestures is over. The world must move beyond condemnation and take concrete action to end the occupation, lift the siege, and hold Israel accountable for its crimes. Section 9, a plea for humanity. The people of Gaza are not asking for pity, they are demanding their fundamental rights, the right to live in freedom and dignity, the right to a future free from fear and oppression. The world must listen. We must act, not out of charity but out of a sense of shared humanity. For in the end, our fate is interconnected. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Let Gaza's plight be a wake-up call. Let us choose the path of justice, the path of peace. Let us build a world where all people, regardless of their ethnicity or religion, can live together in equality and harmony.